Okay, let's do this review. All right, let's get started. It's exam 1 review, so we're reviewing exam 1, of course. Makes sense. So we want to talk about communication, one of the most basic things we talk about in the class. So I want you to know the difference between communication, language, and speech. Communication, of course, is an exchange of information across a medium. Remember the pendulums that synced up because they were able to feel each other's vibrations across a board. Language, then, of course, is like the kind of it's more specific. It's a system of rules of communication. We have, put certain communication rules in place, like a grammar is one of those things, and different words that we use. Speech, of course, is one of the ways that we communicate with language. It's one of the ways that we send information across a medium with those rules that are our language. In speech, we've got phonemes and morphemes, although you can also have morphemes in written communication as well. It's the unit of meaning. So you have that for both speech and writing. Phonemes, however, just in speech. It's the minimal unit of utterance, like a distinguishable different sound that you make. So that's just going to be in speech. You don't have phonemes in writing. You have graphemes, which is a similar thing, but for writing. And you do have morphemes for both. So that's communication, language, and speech. Impairment versus a disability. Well, remember, in general terms, impairment is just going to be something like any difference from baseline. So anything that's not typical, something that's slightly diminished, is going to be an impairment. You can have a very slight hearing impairment. That doesn't mean it's a disability. A disability is something that causes you not to be able to function the way that you would like to, or a person not to be able to function the way that they would like to. So they're having trouble communicating, they're having trouble working, they're having trouble otherwise enjoying life. That's a disability. An impairment is just a slight diminishment, it's not a word, of their capability. All right, so organic versus functional. Organic, by the way, sorry, what you should be doing, you have these slides. Try to answer these yourselves. And then while I'm going through, if you haven't looked at the slides yet, pause this, try to answer it yourself, then see if your answer is on target with what I'm saying. All right. So organic versus functional. Well, organic is something that we can look for to find an identifiable cause. A stroke is going to be something that's organic. We can see that there was a cause to it. Something like ataxia or any other sort of generalized muscular weakness, disorder that causes generalized muscular weakness, this is going to be organic. We can say like this speech impairment is caused by this problem. We have an identifiable cause. Functional, more like my slight lisp that I have, is something that there isn't an identifiable cause for. Why do I do it this way? Unknown. It just is the way it is. And so that's functional. A lot of, if you want to put this in like really overgeneralized terms, which is never going to be 100% accurate, a lot of the issues that kids will come to speech with, a lot of those are functional. Again, generalized. That's not going to always be true. You've seen videos of children that have ataxia. Of course, that's an organic disorder, but a lot of the kids that you might see eventually in your practice, it'll be something functional. It'll be like they persist in saying their R's like W's much longer than they should. Well, why? We don't know. And then if you're working in a hospital, again, overgeneralizing, you're probably going to see a lot of organic causes. Not always, but in very large general terms, that's where you're going to see these. Developmental versus acquired. This is like, have you always had it? Developmental is like this kind of showed up as you developed speech, and acquired is something that, happened right then. Oftentimes, something that's organic is going to be acquired. But again, not always. It's not like they go hand in hand. So, developmental could be, again, like the Lisp. That's developmental. That's been there. And acquired would be, again, like a stroke, right? So something that, oh, this has happened. Now you've acquired this problem. Semantics, lexicon, syntax, and pragmatics, well, they're all important. And some of these have multiple definitions that I want you to know one specific definition of for this class. Actually, it's just lexicon that has the two. But anyway, semantics are the real fine usage of the word. When exactly do you use the word? What small connotations does it have? How, it's like below grammar. Semantics is like, what's exactly the right word for the connotation here? That's semantics. Lexicon. So lexicon can be a dictionary. It can be a collection of all the words in the language, which doesn't have to be a dictionary because it could just be a list of the words. But in terms of our class, it's also the words that you have. So you have a lexicon in your head. And then every language has a lexicon as well. And so what I want you to know for this is like, it's the words that you know. All the words that a person knows, that's their lexicon. There is, again, this kind of like amorphously defined lexicon that every language has. A dictionary isn't an exhaustive lexicon. Like, it is a lexicon, but a lot of times there's old words and a lot of unused words that aren't included in the dictionary. So you can have this like list of just all the words that exist in a language. That's a lexicon. Or you can have like another kind of amorphous list in your brain of all the words that you know, and that's a lexicon as well. That's the one that you're going to see on the exam, the one that pertains to the person. Syntax. This is how words are organized. Grammar is would fit into syntax. And then pragmatics. We've talked about this. This is where people with ASD have trouble. This is like the interpersonal rules, kind of more of the social conventions that go along with using language. What you should say when, stuff like that. Okay, so yeah, okay. So distinctive features is one of the first ways that people tried to describe spoken language. That's not the way that I've phrased that statement is not true. It's not one of the first ways people tried to describe spoken language. They've tried to describe spoken language for eons, but like one of the first mathematical ways that we tried to get to the point of artificially replicating speech, I guess is the way that I should say it. So this is a series of zeros and ones, pluses and minuses, yeses and nos. And this would say, like, is it voiced or unvoiced? Is it velar? Is it not velar? Is it palatal, right? And so if it's velar, there's a 1. And then if it's velar, then of course you're going to have a 0 in palatal. If it's voiced, you're going to have a 1. If it's obviously, if you have a 1 in voice, then you're going to have a 0 in unvoiced. So it's kind of this very like binary code sort of structure, trying to describe exactly how the mouth is moving, like a machine. This approach has changed because we know that there are things like arda, da, and arda. If you say those, and ga and alga, then the G is not produced in the exact same place. So we can't go at it with just zeros and ones because we have something called co-articulation, which is there's a range of where and how we can produce most of our sounds. An E can be an E, or it can be an E or it can be an E. And my mouth is in a slightly different configuration in all those different ways that I've said that. You understand it as an E. It could come up in any word, and any of those different ways could be an E. You'd hear it as an E. And so you can't say that there's one certain way to produce an E. What we do now is we have kind of these neural nets, and they all have weightings and percentages to it. And so you can say like, oh, in this area, like the percentage, like this is an E. And if you're coming from this sound, you just need to get close enough to be in the range. And if you're then going to move to this next sound, then you can move through that range, and you'll be more in the middle of the E range or something like that. But essentially, it's more complicated, is what I want you to know. We use probabilities and neural networks, and not just zeros and ones. And then the other big thing to know here is co-articulation. That's the reason why distinctive features isn't very useful anymore. Okay, so we mentioned this extremely briefly when we were talking about speech anatomy, but the only thing muscles can do is what? Can they push? No. I mean, it seems like you can use muscles to push, but that's not exactly true. What's happening is that the muscles are only contracting. So if you think about your arm, like your muscle, this muscle here can only contract. So it's going to like contract like this and pull this part of my arm up. If I want to push the arm out, what I'm going to do is contract this muscle here, and then it pushes the arm out. So this muscle, then this muscle. There's no pushing. Muscles don't push. The only thing they can do is contract and relax. So it's not like they can only contract. Then you only have one movement you could ever do in your life. They contract and relax, but no pushing. And I think that's really important to know. It's important to know for this class. It's really important to know for 310. So if you end up taking 310 with me or Dr. Weinhold or Dr. Deliri, I think we're possibly the only three that teach it. I'm not sure. But you're going to need it. You're going to need to know that. You need to know that muscles can only contract and pull. And then you have to figure out, like, well, how do you get that movement with muscles that can only pull? So the power source for speech is breathing. We can say the diaphragm, we could say the lungs. Any of that's true, but essentially all you need to know is breathing. Breathing is the power source. The sound source for speech is the larynx or the vocal folds. That's what's actually creating the buzz that you need to be able to produce sound. The diaphragm is the major breathing muscle. It's kind of parachute shaped. This, to cue your memory, this is, we went over this when I was still at home quarantined. So to me, it seems like they're almost two different classes. Maybe if you guys are attending online, it seems like the same class. But anyway, so think about it that way. So the diaphragm is this kind of parachute-shaped muscle. And again, muscles can only pull. So what happens with this is these muscle fibers are pulling against the center, and that makes it like kind of flatten down. And then up here, your lungs are up here above it. And so then that inflates the lungs. That's the diaphragm. What you really need to know from there is it's the major breathing muscle. Speech breathing versus quiet tidal breathing. The only thing you really need to know here is that quiet, regular tidal breathing it pretty much just involves the diaphragm. Speech breathing is going to involve more muscles. It's going to recruit other muscles to lift the rib cage when you're breathing in, and then also the abs to push air out, and some other muscles as well. But what you need to know is quiet breathing is just diaphragm. There's a lot more muscles, including the abs, that you're using for speech breathing. If you want to talk louder, you use more airflow. So more power source equals louder. The major cartilages of the larynx that I want you guys to know are the thyroid cartilage, which is this one you can feel right here, the cricoid cartilage, which is right behind it, and the arytenoid cartilage. The arytenoid cartilage is the one that actually holds the vocal folds. It's what connects to the vocal folds, and so when they move, they're going to move, and that's what's going to cause the vocal folds to adduct and abduct. What is a sound wave? It's a pressure wave moving through the air. So we talked about this briefly. We're going to talk about it more in depth in later lectures, but essentially you've got an area where the air is very compressed, and then behind it the air is very not compressed, and so you go through these compressed, not compressed, compressed, not compressed. That's a sound wave. So it's a pressure wave moving through the air. It's compressed and uncompressed air. How is sound produced from the vocal folds? Essentially what is happening is the vocal folds are kind of like opening and closing like this. So you push sound through them, and they're going to open and close like this. So when they're open, you get this like high pressure. Then they close, and you get low pressure. So then high pressure, low pressure, high pressure, low pressure. And then you get that wave emanating from the vocal folds. All right. Different shapes of resonators make different sounds. They make different phonemes, especially different vowel phonemes. So resonators is everything from the larynx up. So all of this pharynx region up here, coming, if you like x-ray in, you've got this pharynx region here, the oral cavity and the nasal cavity. Those are all resonators. And different shapes of those are going to shape the buzz that comes from the larynx. So it's going to go ah, e, oo, like that. That's what different shapes of the resonators make. Different stop placement, voicing, and airflow make different consonants. So stop placement could be like f, like that. Voicing is the difference between p and b, s and z, like that, and different amounts of airflow. You have to push more for the p's and stuff like that, so you get the pop. I have a pop filter on, but let me hear. I'll just ruin your ears. For a p. Okay. So vowels, then consonants. Okay, so let's talk about ethics really quickly. What you want to do is you want to be able to give the highest quality service. This is the one that I always say is obvious, except for the fact that to be able to give the highest quality service, you also have to be constantly learning what's new in the profession. So if you're learning what's new in the profession, if you're staying up and doing continuing education, that's how you can give highest quality service. It doesn't mean get enough. It doesn't only mean get enough sleep and don't come to work drunk. It also means stay up on the current trends. And then don't discriminate. Don't misrepresent yourself or coworkers. So if you have an assistant, you should let people know that they're an assistant and not like a equal colleague. Don't give people false hope, only a likely prognosis. So don't promise them that you're going to fix them. Don't say like, oh, well, we will have you saying S in a week. Don't say that. You can say, I've had a lot of clients that look like you. Oftentimes, we're able to help them. Do not give them false hope and promises, though. You have to provide notice of the end of service. So if you are going to go on vacation or change your job or move or something like that, you have to give at least a month to allow people to figure out how to change their service, because any gap can be bad. I mean, so think about when we're talking about bilingualism, a gap, if you're speaking English only at the school and then only, say, Spanish at home, the gap, the summer gap, will then set back the English. Or conversely, if you have been speaking Spanish at home, but then you go to the United States for school where everything's English, and then you come back, say, to Ecuador in the summer, all of a sudden, your first language, you've had such a gap, you're not speaking it very well. So this is true also with different kinds of services. If you're learning how to say your S in a different way, and you have a gap, you're going to revert back to the way that you were. Now you've got to start all over. So anyway, any gaps are not good. And then lastly, you have a duty to report any of these other things above this if people you work with are breaking any of those ethical standards. We always have a duty to report that to ASHA. Okay, and then public trust. Don't misinterpret scholarly contributions or research findings. So only talk about what's actually true from the research. Make sure that when you're telling your clients what a research study says, read it and understand it. Don't just be like, well, I don't know, it says that if you put a fish in your ear, you can hear better. Whatever. At least I think that's what it says. Read it and understand it. Avoid conflicts of interest. This is big in specifically audiology. There's a little bit more of this. So if you get a kickback from a company, that's not great. You can't take kickbacks. You can try things out. So they can offer free samples. And if you're sampling it, or if you're giving free samples to clients just to sample things, that's okay. But once it gets into the realm of like, we're going to give you free samples, and now we're going to continue giving you free samples if you sell X number of these, that gets a little weird, because then you may be trying to sell more of those so that you continue having these free samples, which is not good. They should just be giving free samples. And if people aren't buying the thing that they're giving free samples of, that's their problem. It's not your problem. They make a crappy product, or it's too expensive or something like that, right? It's not you. You shouldn't let them pressure you into selling a certain number of units to continue getting the free samples. It's ridiculous. Anyway, that's when you get into conflict of interest. It gets into bribery. Don't take bribes. So if you have something that's really obvious, like if you sell 20 of our hearing aids in a month, we'll give you a cruise. That's totally unethical. That's definitely unethical. Okay, Lumosity. We didn't get to this in class, so it's good that we can talk about this really quickly. Lumosity recently got in trouble. So this, if you use this app, maybe you should delete it. I think you have to pay for it too, so you should ask for your money back. They claim that they can help you get smarter. And what they do is they give you a whole bunch of these things, working memory tests. We did kind of a simulation of a working memory test in class when I was talking about the giant rat maze that I helped make with other colleagues. So this app basically has you do a whole bunch of working memory tests. They call them games. And then they say that if you do these, like once a day for like a month, then you're getting smarter. And what has been shown time and time again in the research is that you can do one working memory game, and you can get better at that working memory game. But the skill that you learned in that one does not transfer to any other working memory measure, nor does it make you smarter. I mean, even if you're defining intelligence as like doing well on working memory tasks, still doesn't work, because you can get really, really, really good at the one that we did in class, which was like, is 2 + 5 8? And then you say no, and then you have to remember a letter. So you can get really good at that. But then that doesn't mean diddly squat when you go to do one that's like where you have to remember the order and placement of dots. The skill isn't going to transfer. So they don't make you smarter. So anyway, they got in a huge amount of trouble. Lumosity got into a huge amount of trouble for claiming this. Big lawsuit. Now they can't say that anymore, but they're still around, and people still pay for it for some reason because they're making you smarter. So anyway, tell your I think it's mostly older people that have this because they start worrying about Alzheimer's and stuff like that. But you don't need to pay for a service like this. Just do some crosswords. They're free. Anyway, so tell your parents and grandparents not to get rid of that. All right, so careers. What degrees and qualifications are necessary for different jobs? So for an SLPA, you need a certificate, a bachelor's degree and a certificate. For SLP, you need at least a master's degree. For AUD, you need a specialized 4-year degree, and for PhD, you need to get a PhD, which is at least 4 years, although nobody ever gets out in 4 years. It's more like 5 plus. Mine took 7. But it was fun. Good. Oh, and then also, you need to be board certified to be an SLP and an AUD. There's also certification processes that go in for those two types of jobs as well. PhDs don't have it because they don't actually we don't see clients, so we don't have to be board certified. There's other things we have to do, though. You don't necessarily need to... Well, this does come in when we talk about research ethics. Every time we do a new research study, something called the Institutional Review Board has to look at the study that we give. So that's kind of like every single thing that you're going to do for research also has to be board okayed. But we don't have to have a separate qualification. So anyway, qualifications for SLP and AUD, bachelor's and a certificate for SLP, master's for SLPA, master's for SLP, 4-year doctorate for AUD, and then the PhD for the PhD, which is typically 5 plus. If you're a crazy person, maybe you can do it in 4, but it's probably not. Where can SLPs work? Hey, you can work in schools, you can work in hospitals, you can work in private care facilities, you can work... Hospitals. The NICU is another one especially for dysphagia for preemies. All these places. AUDs, very similar. You could work in schools, though usually schools contract out to private practices. So you can work in a private practice, you can work in a hospital, you can work in private care facilities, all sorts of things like that. They're very similar in the areas where they're going to be working. What about the main functions of an SLP? I'm talking very generally here. So one thing that you can do is you can help people with speech. Another thing that you can do is help people with swallowing disorders. And also voice disorders is the third one. So speech problems, more with the articulators. So you have articulatory problems with speech. SLPs can help with that. Swallowing problems. SLPs can help with that. And then you can have voice disorders, which is something more down here with the actual voicing mechanism, so the larynx and stuff like that. And you can have SLPs help with voice disorders as well. We're going to talk about the swallowing and voice disorders more as we go through the class. We've covered a lot of articulatory things, so we'll have more of that in this review. The others, you just need to know it, and then we'll talk more deeply about it later. What does this graph mean? What you need to know is, I'm going to ask you a question like, by what age do 50% of children master the sound? And you would say, what would you say? By 4, right? 50% have it by 4. And how many have it by the end of 8 years? What percentage of children have it by the end of 8 years? If you said 90, you're right. If you said 100, you're wrong. It's not 100. It's 90. So 50, 90. All of these bars. 50 is on the left side, 90% is on the right side, and this just kind of charts when people are expected to get these. Remember, it's a range. Of course. Like if we're measuring by when 50% of children start having these, that means that 50% of children have started mastering these phonemes before that. And if 90% have it by the right side, that means 10% of children who do end up mastering these master it after the end of this bar. So there's a range. If you are one of my students who has children and you're looking at this and you're like, my kid hasn't started saying G, or they haven't started saying it correctly, and they're 5, is this a problem? Maybe, maybe not, right? I mean, like, it's 90% have it by then. 10% of kids are not expected to have it by then. This is when we have that problem where it's like, is it a delay or is it a disorder? Is it a persistent delay and then we merge that into a disorder eventually at some kind of arbitrary time? Or is it just a delay and they'll get it? I don't know. It's hard to tell. I mean, that's the thing. There's not a good answer for that. One answer is, how are they doing with their other sounds? Right? So, like, if they're pretty good across the board and it's just G that they're kind of having a problem with, maybe they're just slow getting the G. But then, of course, if it persists, say, again, this is arbitrary, but if it goes a long time, then you might want to say that's a persistent delay. Maybe they need to have the services for that. So that's the maddening thing about this profession, is when does a delay become a disorder? All right, let's talk about typical speech development. Nature versus nurture. I am a nurture person. It's all like a behaviorist kind of thing. Stimulus response, boop bop. I don't think speech is special. But of course, there's no answer to this game. Nobody knows if it's nature or nurture. A lot of people say that it's, somewhere in the middle. I think they're just kind of like covering themselves. That's why I wanted you guys to say what you think it is. Likely it is somewhere in the middle, because most things are somewhere in the middle, especially when we're talking about these scientific things. Somebody will be like, it's this. No, it's this. It's usually a little bit of both. And this probably is too. But anyway, what you need to know is the nature people think that speech is innate. It is special. That we have something called a language acquisition device, something called universal grammar, and that this is there. Language is going to develop no matter what. That's a special thing that develops in the human. The nurture people say, I don't know. We have the capacity for speech and people are talking, and so then we learn how to talk because it makes it easier for us to say what we want. And that's how we develop speech. Nothing really special about it. All right. Infant attention development. So the first thing infants are going to focus on, I don't need names on this, but I do want to know the patterns that we see. So first, the attention is going to be on the primary caregiver, whoever's taking care of them at the moment. The attention is on that person. Then they go to shared attention, a very close things. You'll say what's that? And then you and this child will look at the things. And then attention kind of blossoms out from there. But first it's right on the primary caregiver, then you have shared attention on things. And then you can go larger from there. Word over and under extension. Overextension is children will think that the definition of a word encompasses a lot more than it actually does. So a person that I used to work with, their kid thought that doggy meant anything that reminded them of a dog at all. And so there's a salad at a party and they point in the salad and they're like, doggy. And everybody's like, what happened to that salad? And it was an olive. It was a black olive because it reminded her of the dog's nose. Everything was dog to this kid. A horse was a dog because it kind of looks like a giant dog. A cat was a dog. An olive apparently was a dog. Everything's a dog. Underextension is a really restricted definition of a word. So cookie to someone might only mean a specific oatmeal raisin cookie. And then you say, oh, you want a cookie? Here is a chocolate chip cookie. And they're like, no, dummy, cookie. And they mean that oatmeal raisin ridiculousness. So that's underextension. Children learn tense structure. Past is the first thing that comes in. Then they're going to learn possessive. That's the second. And then it kind of blossoms out from there. But it typically goes in that order at first, right? So they learn a word, and then they learn like the past tense of that word. Then they learn a lot of their like possessive versions of that. Kind of correlates with when they start saying like, mine, this is mine. So they use possessive tense structure, past tense, then possessive, and then out of there we kind of blossom out. The significance of that gibberish song that I showed you is that is kind of the acoustic signature of American English, and that is what babies kind of tune into before they start saying their first word. So like pre 1 year, they're tuning into their own language, even though they're not speaking it yet. And so they're kind of hearing that acoustic signature, which is in that song. Syntactic development, I think I took that off the exam, so you don't need to worry about that. What are speech errors typically seen in typical development? Oh, okay. So that's a weird way to write that. Basically, what I want you to know is fronting is a typical error. So we can go, if you have cape, kids will often say tape instead of cape. This is fronting. You're pushing the phoneme to the front of the mouth. Again, this is where you can see it. And that's why they tend to like to push these things to the front. That's normal. Also, a lot of our soda errors that we talked about, right? So substitutions, omissions, distortions, and additions. These are other typical things that you see in development. So substitutions, saying a W instead of an R. Wed. Omissions, leaving stuff out. Especially if you have like something where you have two consonants together like truck, it might come out as tuck. They're omitting the R because it's hard to put all those different consonants together. Substitutions, omissions, distortions. Distortions, the lisp that I have a little bit is a distortion. It's not a TH, so it's not a substitution. It's just a slightly distorted S. So you'll see that as well. And then additions, sometimes if the kid is trying to master saying all of the consonants, they might insert an extra vowel to give them space to get it out. The example that I use in class is they're trying to say blue. It's hard to go from the B to the L, so they might go blue. And so they have like a little bit of a B-U-L-U-E kind of thing. They go blue. So that's an addition. The difference between a delay and a disorder, we kind of talked about that, right? Like it's difficult to see. Disorder could be a persistent delay. But sometimes there are obvious causes. So backing is one obvious thing. It's not part of typical development. So then you can say like that is much more indicative of a disorder. Backing would be if you're trying to back further in their mouth. Something's wrong there because, again, usually we